Good day. The topic addressed in this presentation is that of our government's intrusion into Syria, for which I am adamantly opposed. My name is Don Mercer and I'm a resident of Virginia. I am known to most by my nickname since childhood, Don, and to some with whom I flew in combat by my call sign Rustic 401. I am today by many people's standards retired, although I remain quite active in writing and in my photography. I served in both the Air Force and Virginia Air National Guard and was discharged honorably from both. While an Air Force pilot in Southeast Asia in 1970 through 71, I flew over 200 combat missions as a forward air controller, or FAC. Most of those missions were flown in Cambodia in support of the Rustic operation, which was at the time highly classified. Throughout my tour of duty in Southeast Asia, the administration of President Richard Nixon repeatedly stated to the American public that we had no forces in Cambodia, or for that matter in Laos. In both cases, the lies told to Americans were of epic proportions, and the billions wasted from our national treasury has yet to be accounted for. It never will. With great irony, the Watergate scandal actually gave cover at the time to Congress and the Nixon administration for all the covert activities and funds expended in wartime activities that occurred in Cambodia. Thus, once Congress was assured that it had the votes to impeach President Nixon, the proposed Cambodia article was removed from the articles of impeachment, lest it divulged the full scope of Nixon's having duped the American public and the extent to which our democracy was failing. In the Air National Guard, I flew fighters, the venerable F-105 Thunder Chief. I went on to enjoy a business career for over 30 years. I have seen the subject of national security used far too many times to protect our politicians and their lives, as opposed to truly protecting our nation. When a presidential administration desires to sway public opinion, information of questionable veracity is distributed, much as with the video clips purportedly depicting victims of chemical weapons in Syria. However, sources and methods of obtaining such information, such so-called actionable intelligence, is generally omitted from distribution, using the argument that to do so would place those methods and sources in danger. How convenient for our politicians. In such instances, my ability to trust our government's elected officials goes to zero because they have such an abysmal track record of credibility. I do not even need to revisit the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that unnecessarily expanded the war in Southeast Asia, or any topic more recently, but for the blatant lies espoused by President George W. Bush's administration that led our nation to attack preemptively and fight in Iraq. On the subject of American involvement in Syria, I am adamantly opposed to our firing the first shot or weapon of any type into that nation unless we come under direct attack from Syria. A nation such as Israel, that is an ally, should come under direct attack, or another nation with which we have an alliance, such as those in NATO, is attacked by Syria. My rationale for avoiding all American involvement in Syria includes the following. The United States, our nation that I dearly love, is under no imminent threat whatsoever from Syria. This will be the second preemptive war the United States has entered into in little more than a decade, the first being Iraq beginning on March 20th, 2003. That was initiated on the basis of lies and falsely assessed intelligence. Thousands of Americans died there, lost body parts, had their minds affected, and many who have survived have had their futures ruined and dramatically changed. To what end? Ultimatums, lines in the sand that are drawn, do not work well in business, in marriage, and certainly not in international relations. The subject of the use of chemical weapons as purportedly used by Syria's Assad regime is sorely lacking in evidence. If Assad were on trial in an American court today, I have no doubt that he would be found not guilty due to reasonable doubt that is significant. I have long ago ceased to believe much of what politicians tout as truth because as an American citizen and as a veteran, I have been lied to so many times. Such lies revolve around issues of billions of dollars spent wastefully and with zero accountability in Cambodia and Laos and the whole of the war in Southeast Asia, to politicians' personal foibles, to their affairs, to the initiation of war on the back of blatant lies, as in Iraq in 2003, which is of far more import than politicians' individual shortcomings. Common sense says that the al-Qaeda operatives amongst the many diverse rebel groups in Syria has far more to gain by the use of such weapons that have drawn the ire of the international community. However, common sense within the Washington, D.C. political arena has been in short supply during most of my life. That concept is certainly missing in any discussion surrounding Syria today. Any discussion of the use of chemical weapons by another nation is hypocritical in the extreme, as the United States government has used white phosphorus, napalm, and propane bombs with abandon since World War II. They may not be sarin gas, but tens of thousands of purported enemies have been killed by directions initiated by American presidents during my lifetime. It is gruesome to see alleged victims of chemical weapons writhing in pain in the videos recently released by our government. To be sure, those images are disturbing. However, every bit as disturbing would be the release of video clips that depicted enemies writhing in pain from having napalm dropped on them, viewing human tissue being eaten to the bone, and then more when an enemy combatant or other human being as collateral damage has been struck with white phosphorus, what was called Willie Pete in Southeast Asia. I am the qualified opinion that most Americans would find a video of waterboarding an American-held prisoner disturbing. Thus, without clear and specific evidence as to the source of such chemical weapons, why rely on such disturbing video as the basis for American involvement in Syria? Based on my limited information, our government stockpiles substantial amounts of chemical weapons and may still continue to manufacture such. For any politician to say that Americans will not suffer from any repercussion of our attacking Syria is utter nonsense. Not only will all Americans who travel be at greater risk, but our valiant men and women in service to our nation will also be placed at greater risk. The United States has vast problems here at home: deteriorating education, poverty and homelessness, raging forest fires for which funds to fight are now running low, a soaring national debt, a recession that for all practical purposes lingers for far too many who have lost their homes, are without jobs, or are employed only part-time or in jobs that are not consistent with their skills. Infrastructure throughout our nation that is deteriorating, that ranges from an out-of-date aviation control system to deteriorating roads to bridges that are deemed to be failures, and a Veterans Administration that is woefully out of step with the needs of the veterans of our many wars. The United States has no business whatsoever in addressing the deaths of 1,400, or frankly, whatever the number is in Syria, because it lacks credible evidence to support President Obama's theory of cause, and because our national interest, other than some politicians' purported view of our national credibility, is at stake. As for the credibility of our United States government, that has long since passed by the wayside for many throughout the world who view it. The war in Southeast Asia, what many term the Vietnam War, was expanded in 1965 on the back of lies told to Congress by President Lyndon B. Johnson that resulted in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The administrations of President Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter stood idly by while an estimated 1.7 million men, women, and children died at the hands of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge during the killing fields in 1975 through 1979. Many Cambodians who died had collaborated with America in their belief, what became delusional, that the United States would fight in Southeast Asia to a successful conclusion. However, strategy and tactics employed throughout Southeast Asia proved ridiculous, at times in the extreme. Our rules of engagement were ludicrous and were intended to have the American fighting man put his life at risk with his hands, more often than not, tied behind his back. How do I know this? Because I personally controlled airstrikes and took enemy fire from structures from which I was prohibited attacking. President Ronald Reagan and his administration officials were involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, at the time facilitating the sale of arms to none other than Iran. President George H.W. Bush, sometimes referred to as Number 41, oversaw a war, Desert Storm, in Kuwait and Iraq, which ended to a great extent in futility. A treaty was signed just inside the border of Iraq, and the ruthless dictator Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power. The United States, had this approach occurred in World War II, may as well have marched into Germany, signed a peace treaty with Hitler, and allowed him to remain in power. Desert Storm was about oil and economic interest. It was certainly not about human rights. Nonetheless, American forces were instructed to annihilate retreating Iraqi forces on the highway of death. In 1994, America under President Bill Clinton stood idly by and watched as over 500,000 Hutu and Tutsi tribesmen killed each other in what has come to be called the Rwandan genocide. So why is it now that some American politicians are getting religion about our nation's credibility? Throughout my lifetime, American taxpayer funds have been not only used to support ill-conceived and ill-executed wars and lesser conflicts, but those monies have been used to support brutal dictators, Batista in Cuba, the Shah in Iran, and even, yes, Saddam Hussein in Iraq for many years. It would be no surprise to me if our government did not send foreign aid to Syria in the millions of dollars along the way. What have any of those funds bought? Even more recently, American foreign aid has been funneled to the purportedly democratically elected president of Egypt, a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood. Is this what I have worked to pay taxes for during my lifetime? This is such a waste of American taxpayer dollars. The end result is that it is no small wonder that the United States of America is technically bankrupt today and that a pathetic fiscal legacy is being left for my children's generation. So American credibility is moot and falls on deaf ears when our president and the likes of John Kerry emphasize that Americans in our nation will be adversely affected if our government does not take action in Syria. American credibility on the international stage is nothing but an illusion. American international diplomacy is, to a great extent, non-existent and has been for many years. In reality, our international relations around much of the world are in shambles, much akin to our nation's deteriorating infrastructure. Yes, our government moves some ships from one sea or ocean to another from time to time as an intended demonstration of power. But to what end? Sailors are kept apart from their families while our government seeks to demonstrate our force. But American force, with no disrespect intended to any man or woman who has served in uniform, is serving, or will serve in the future, has been seldom used during my lifetime with a clearly defined strategy and with battle tactics that are designed to bring an enemy, any enemy, to its knees. Our American politicians have become far too adept at directing our military, among the greatest the world has ever seen, from the vantage point of its men and women serving, their training, and their equipment, but to only one end, to play at war. The United States of America has witnessed no clear victory since World War II, and the list of abject failures, most fought to no success whatsoever, is long and a growing one. This list includes Korea, South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Iraq, now twice, and Afghanistan, comprising our major wars with innumerable minor conflicts that have been undertaken. Along with supporting Saddam Hussein, our hard-earned taxpayer dollars even went to support Osama bin Laden when he was aligned with the Mujahideen in their fight against the Russians in Afghanistan prior to our entrance there in 2001. Why place American boots on the ground in such large numbers when the end result is providing our enemies such a large target-rich environment, with their targets being among some of our youngest and most vibrant citizens? Our government did so in Iraq, and we have nothing to show for it. Recent news reports have just under 1,000 Iraqis losing their lives in July 2013 in sectarian terrorist bombing attacks raging throughout that country. Today, American forces remain in Afghanistan, a nation approximately 90% the size of the state of Texas. Our forces have now been there for close to 12 years, slightly more than 3 times the period of time in which the United States fought in World War II. Yet that war was fought around the world and resulted in unconditional surrenders from our adversaries in 1945. Politicians from both major political parties in the United States have persisted in initiating war after war and military engagements ad nauseum throughout my lifetime, with little to show for any of them other than American deaths and the deaths of our allies who thought the United States had the political will to win. This premise has been demonstrated time and time again, through no fault of most who serve in our military, that our government no longer possesses the will to win a war and has not for over 6 decades. I say most in the military because there are more than a few generals and admirals who, had they had any integrity, would have resigned rather than placing some of their men and women in harm's way. Yet for some of that rank, many of whom are truly politicians themselves, they would rather have a place in some history book than having balked at some idiotic political directive that was fraught with flawed strategy and or tactics. So we are now as a nation on the cusp of firing an American shot into Syria because our president drew a line in the sand. No, today it is not his, as he has now assigned that line to the nations that signed the treaty banning the use of chemical weapons. Yet I see few of those nations willing to enforce such a treaty, even though Syria was not a signatory. Of course, Syria did not sign that treaty, and in effect, it has not broken that treaty. But then the United States was not a signatory to the Geneva Accords that ended the French war in their Indochina in 1954. However, the United States under President Dwight David Eisenhower began to insert advisors into South Vietnam in January 1955 on the heels of the French exodus in December 1954, following France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. But so much for specific history lessons in this brief presentation. Virtually every military engagement that has been fought during the last 6+ decades following the end of World War II in 1945 has suffered from mission creep. Once American forces have entered some fray, the law of unintended consequences rears its ugly head, and the use of force, the number of American combatants, the types of weapons, and/or the geographic area begins to expand. One prime example of this is our ongoing warfare conducted on Pakistani territory. You can only imagine what Americans would think and do if another sovereign nation lobbed missiles repeatedly at targets in our nation. If you think that we have many friends in Pakistan, I am of the opinion that such a thought is further delusional. Today, our government wants to go to war on a strategize-as-you-fight basis. There may be no more foolhardy endeavor undertaken by an American president and Congress, where we have seen where a design-as-you-build concept has taken our taxpayer dollars with the construction of the F-35, touted as the next-generation fighter that our nation ostensibly needs so badly. I contend that there will be no need for such a weapon system, let alone one that is being designed as it is constructed, a flawed methodology if there ever was one. Our government has been unable to win a single war during my lifetime in which purported state-of-the-art technology has been used. So why build more such weapons when there has not been the political will to use any since World War II to win a clear victory from any enemy? Today, our politicians of both major political parties have created a worldwide scenario that resembles much of what Great Britain formed and experienced. It was once said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and we have seen what the ultimate cost of that has been to our ally. However, American politicians persist in distracting the American public with ruses such as that in Syria, while our own nation's infrastructure continues to deteriorate. Why should it be up to a hypocritical American government to stick our nose into the business of another nation in which we as a nation have no vital interest whatsoever? There is no American politician, general or admiral in our military, or person within our government's intelligence community who may state unequivocally that our intrusion into Syria will be limited. To believe that anyone has such a crystal ball is absurd. Such assertions will end, as they have with many other lies told to the American public, when the person or agency espousing such drivel figuratively eats glass. So much for crystal balls. The only clear winner in this discussion of American intrusion into Syria is our military-industrial complex, the very entity of which President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell speech given in January 1961. But then that industry, our so-called defense industry, that is a misnomer of considerable proportion, continues to pocket billions when new munitions are required because American stockpiles are drawn down in every battle and war undertaken. If and when the United States of America engages in warfare in Syria, why not have the Department of Defense revert to its former title, the War Department, because that is what it will best represent. But then that might well have been done when I served with many honorable Americans in Southeast Asia. The hypocrisy of American politicians ranges far and wide. Why was no rescue effort ever mounted aside from the Sante raid to free American POWs held in North Vietnam? The simple answer is that our government did not want to risk China's intervening in that war, which I might add, it did to a limited extent. So why enter a military theater of operations, any geographic area around the world, when not prepared to engage our forces to whatever extent required to win a war conclusively? When the first American shot is fired in Syria, our government will have declared a de facto war not only on Syria but also on all its allies, to include Russia. Are some of our politicians so naive to believe that, given American history, a limited war is capable of being maintained? Apparently, many of our politicians have been so naive in the past, so why expect a different outcome in the future? After all, the definition of insanity is that of repeating the same thing over and over again while expecting different results. Isn't that exactly where we are now in the discussion of Syria? Limited war is like limited pregnancy. You're either pregnant or you're not. In like manner, a nation is either at war or it is not. Make no mistake about it. American military involvement against Syria is an act of war. Once that genie is let out of the bottle, no one, certainly not any American politician, man or woman in our military, or person in our intelligence community, may provide any certainty as to the outcome of such a war. Have we learned nothing from the French and their military defeats in what was once their French Indochina? It is with some irony that the French are now standing in lockstep with President Obama. It is apparent that their leaders are wholly unaware of their own national history. Why have not American politicians learned anything from even the Russian war in Afghanistan that led to that nation's exodus from that region? Have our politicians learned anything from my generation's American military and political history? For those elected officials who might vote to support any military action in Syria, I submit that they indeed have not learned a thing from our involvement in Southeast Asia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The end result in supporting American military involvement in Syria will be that the United States of America is doomed to repeat its own history. The ultimate gain to politicians in initiating a war with Syria, as with many past wars during my lifetime, has two predominant, proven, and time-tested results. Firstly, jobs are created in our mislabeled defense industry. And secondly, at least for a period of time, such important discussions of the day to include education, health care, infrastructure rebuilding, and even the soaring national debt suffer because warring creates such a national distraction. After all, international war trumps domestic policy, as we have seen time and again. The downside is that many of our young men and women serving our nation in uniform may lose their lives, lose body parts, lose part or all of their minds and emotional stability, with many having their futures dramatically altered, some entirely ruined. That is what occurred in Southeast Asia. To what end? That is what occurred in Iraq. To what end? That is what has occurred and continues to occur in Afghanistan. To what end? Why are so many of our politicians so intent on America being the greatest warmongering nation in the world's history? Yes, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao may vie for distinction when it comes to body count, along with those such as Pol Pot, but the United States of America has laid claim to the greatest time period of any single nation consistently being at war in modern times. And in the final sense, when we next go to war with great cause, I recommend to all our politicians and those in our military hierarchy a great thesis, The Art of War by Chinese warrior General Sun Tzu. Surprise is of great import, but that seems to continuously escape our politicians, and even some in the military. Taking the high ground is apparently no longer of import, as demonstrated by building a fire support base in the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan, only to have enemy gunners rain fire down on our troops. Have those within our political power structure and military hierarchy taken leave of their senses? That appears to be the case, and appears to have been the case now for a number of decades. I have said for some time now, after returning from my combat tour in Southeast Asia, that I believe there must be intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Why? Because I have seen little intelligence from our elected officials and those in power in many other nations to address such paramount issues as conserving our natural resources, truly improving education and the pay of our teachers, and overcoming hunger and poverty that runs rampant throughout our world. To now strike at Syria with American hypocrisy and our history lessons that should have been learned is ludicrous in the extreme. Every American has a vested interest in this discussion. Every time American force is brought to bear anywhere in the world, let alone in a preemptive manner such as is being entertained now in Congress for the second time in little more than a decade, your ability to travel throughout this world of ours may be adversely impacted. While I have seldom done so, I have written to the President, my 2 senators, and my congressman voicing my opposition to American involvement in Syria, unless that nation undertakes a direct attack on the United States, Israel as our ally, or any other allied nation such as those within NATO. I have also called the offices of my 2 senators and congressmen to voice my opposition to the use of any American military force in Syria. And of the utmost import, such proposed action taken against Syria will, I emphasize, place our courageous men and women in our armed forces at even more risk. Those who serve our nation in uniform deserve far better. Far too few politicians have given the respect to our men and women in the armed forces during my lifetime, which those servicemen and women deserve. In closing, I offer just a few more thoughts. Firstly, the United States of America that I so dearly love remains the greatest bastion of freedom that the world has ever seen. My ability to voice my opinion against the backdrop of many national politicians so bent on going to war yet once again and without just cause is one of the greatest freedoms any democracy has to offer its citizens. And if we are led into yet another meaningless war that has great potential to expand, I may then exercise my vote in the hopes of removing from elected office those who support such wanton use of our military might. That said, I find it frustrating in the extreme, especially as a veteran of combat who has experienced the cost that war extracts on combatants, their friends, and families, to have my voice heard against the din of so many politicians bent on entering yet another fruitless war with no clearly defined strategy. Have many of our national politicians lost their senses? Indeed, they apparently have. Lastly, I offer a quote by Mark Twain. Quote, "A true patriot is one who loves his country all the time and his government when it deserves it." End quote.